Azure Authentication in FastMCP just got simpler. But did you know environment variables can handle everything from tenant configuration to government cloud support? We'll walk through the complete Azure OAuth setup using environment variables, covering all required parameters plus optional configurations like custom redirect paths, government cloud support, and scope handling. You'll see exactly how to configure tenant options, handle mounted servers with issuer URLs, and properly format scopes, all while keeping credentials secure and out of your codebase.
Use the Azure provider. FastMCP server auth equals FastMCP server auth providers. Azure provider. Azure OAuth credentials. FastMCP server auth Azure client ID equals 835F09B6-0 F0 F40CC85 CBF32 C5829 A149. FastMCP server auth Azure client secret equals your client secret here. FastMCP server auth Azure tenant ID equals 08541B6E646D43 DA0 EB834E6713D 6D5. FastMCP server auth Azure base URL equals https://yourserver.com. FastMCP server auth Azure required scopes equals read, write. Optional custom API configuration. FastMCP server auth Azure identifier URI equals API / your API ID. Request additional upstream scopes optional. FastMCP server auth Azure additional authorized scopes equals user. Read, mail, read. This demonstrates the OAuth proxy pattern with specialized handling for Azure's enterprise authentication requirements. The configuration establishes a secure bridge between Azure's OAuth 2 implementation and FastMCP's RPC framework, validating JWT tokens while accommodating Azure's specific tenant models and scope handling. The distinctive aspect is its support for both standard Azure Commercial Cloud and government cloud deployments through configurable authority endpoints. The pattern operates by externalizing authentication concerns while maintaining strict token validation. Azure handles the initial authentication flow, but FastMCP validates the resulting tokens against your application's client ID and required scopes, which are automatically prefixed with your application's identifier URI. The configuration supports flexible scope definitions, comma, space, or JSON separated, and multiple tenant models, with redirect paths that must match your Azure app registration exactly. This separation allows enterprise-grade authentication without modifying your core RPC implementation. This approach solves the critical problem of integrating Azure's strict OAuth implementation with modern RPC frameworks. You gain access to Azure's full authentication features, including multi-factor auth, conditional access policies, and government cloud support, while maintaining FastMCP's simple tool-based programming model. The trade-off is the initial configuration complexity, but the result is production-grade security that meets enterprise compliance requirements without ongoing maintenance overhead. Let's break it down line by line. Use the Azure provider. FastMCP server auth equals FastMCP server auth providers. Azure provider.
This selects Azure as FastMCP's authentication provider, delegating token validation to Azure AD. The provider handles OAuth flows, scope validation, and user identity mapping for all RPC endpoints. Key configuration requirements: client ID and tenant ID, or organizations/consumers, for multi-tenant identify your Azure app registration. Client secret must be securely stored, never hard-coded, for server-to-Azure communication. Base URL defines your server's public endpoint for callback handling. Required scopes,
comma space JSON separated enforce minimum permissions, auto prefixed with your identifier URI, default. API//client ID. Redirect path, default. Auth callback must match your Azure Apps registered redirect URI. Government clouds require base authority override, e.g. https://login Microsoft inline us. Mounted servers need explicit issuer URL configuration. Optional settings like additional authorized scopes request extra Azure permissions but aren't validated by FastMCP. Always register your identifier URI and scopes in Azure portal first.
Azure OAuth credentials. FastMCP Azure client ID equals 835F09B6-0 F0 F40CC85 CBF32 C5829 A149.
This is your Azure OAuth provider configuration for FastMCP. The client ID uniquely identifies your app registration in Azure AD, while client secret proves your app's identity. Never hardcode this in production. Tenant ID can be a specific directory ID, organizations for multi-tenant apps, or consumers for Microsoft accounts. Base URL sets your server's public endpoint, while redirect path default. Auth callback must match your Azure app registration. Required scopes defines permissions your API demands. These are automatically prefixed with your identifier URI default. API//client ID and support comma, space, or JSON separated formats. For government clouds, override base authority, and for mounted servers, set issuer URL to your token endpoint. Additional scopes in additional authorized scopes request extra permissions but aren't validated by FastMCP. Always register these settings in Azure AD first. Configure redirect URIs, define scopes, and set the identifier URI.
FastMCP Auth Azure client secret equals your client secret here.
This is your Azure OAuth client secret, the confidential key that authenticates your FastMCP server with Azure AD. It must match the secret registered in your Azure app and should never be hard-coded, use environment variables, or a secrets manager. For production deployments, you'll also need to configure FastMCP Server Auth Azure Redirect Path, default auth callback, matching your Azure app's reply URL, FastMCP Server Auth Azure Issuer URL, if using mounted servers, FastMCP Server Auth Azure Base Authority for government clouds, e.g. https://login Microsoft inline us. The tenant ID can be a specific GUID, organizations for multi-tenant, or consumers for Microsoft accounts. Required scopes automatically inherit the identifier URI prefix default, API//client ID, and support comma, space, or JSON separated formats.
FastMCP Auth Azure tenant ID equals 08541B6E646D43 DA0 EB834E6713D 6D5.
This defines your Azure AD tenant identifier, which can be a specific directory ID, organizations for multi-tenant apps, or consumers for Microsoft personal accounts. It routes authentication requests to the correct Azure AD instance, with the default authority being https://login, Microsoft inline, com/tenant, or configurable via FastMCP Server Auth Azure Base Authority for government clouds. The tenant ID works with FastMCP Server Auth Azure Redirect Path Default Auth Callback to complete the OAuth flow, while FastMCP Server Auth Azure Issuer URL handles token validation for mounted servers. Required for all Azure integrations, but supports flexible formats including GUIDs, common endpoints, or consumer accounts.
FastMCP Auth Azure Base URL equals https://your server com.
This configures Azure AD OAuth integration for FastMCP's RPC authentication layer. The base URL defines your server's public endpoint for OAuth redirects and token validation, critical for Azure's security checks and token issuance. For production, you must also set FastMCP Server Auth Azure Redirect Path Default Auth Callback to match your Azure app registration's reply URL. Government clouds require FastMCP Server Auth Azure Base Authority, e.g. https://login Microsoft Inline US for US Gov. The tenant entity accepts either a specific directory ID, organizations for multi-tenant, or consumers for Microsoft accounts. Scopes in required scopes auto-prepend the identifier URI default, API//client ID, and support comma, space, or JSON array formats. Additional authorized scopes like user, read, bypass validation and aren't exposed to clients. Never hardcode secrets, use environment variables or a secrets manager. For mounted servers, set FastMCP Server Auth Azure Issuer URL to override the default token issuer endpoint. FastMCP Server Auth Azure required scopes equals read, write. This enforces minimum permission requirements for Azure OAuth tokens, specifying which scopes must be present in the access token. The comma-separated values are automatically prefixed with your application's identifier URI, creating fully qualified scope claims like API//your-API-ID/read. Without matching scopes, FastMCP rejects the authentication attempt even with valid credentials. Hash optional custom API configuration. Hash FastMCP Server Auth Azure identifier URI equals API//your-API-ID. Hash request additional upstream scopes optional. Hash FastMCP Server Auth Azure additional authorized scopes equals user, read, mail, read. These commented lines extend Azure OAuth configuration for specialized scenarios. Identifier URI overrides the default API//client ID scope prefix used in token validation, while additional authorized scopes requests extra Microsoft Graph permissions during login. These aren't validated by FastMCP or exposed to clients. For production deployments, you'll also need FastMCP Server Auth Azure Redirect Path defaults to auth callback to match your Azure app registration. FastMCP Server Auth Azure Issuer URL for mounted servers to specify the token issuer endpoint. FastMCP Server Auth Azure Base Authority for government cloud support, e.g. https://login Microsoft Inline US. Tenant ID accepts either a specific directory ID, organizations for multi-tenant apps, or consumers for Microsoft accounts. Required scopes supports comma, space, or JSON separated lists and are automatically prefixed with the identifier URI. Azure OAuth configuration pattern. These environment variables establish a complete OAuth proxy between Azure's identity platform and FastMCP's RPC framework, where simple key-value pairs implement complex authentication flows. The tenant ID determines your authentication universe, specific ID for single tenant, organizations for multi-tenant, or consumers for personal accounts, while the redirect path must exactly match your Azure app registration's callback URI.
The configuration that disappears into environment variables becomes the foundation of all trust.